Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, time to go back and talk about the Artificer again. When the Artificer first came out in Eberron Rising of the Last War, I did a bunch of videos. I went over the entire class, I did a bit of question and answer, and then I did builds for each of the subclasses. Today, I mainly want to go over the changes to the base Artificer class. They fixed a few things for us here. And I want to go over the new subclass, which is the Armorer. And I want to focus most of this video on looking at the new subclass, the Armorer. But before we get into that, I want to thank some of my patrons. I have a Patreon. The link is in the video description down below if you're interested. These are some of my top level patrons, and their support helps me take the time to review the content as I do and bring you these videos. Today I want to thank Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David F., Dewey Cheatham and Howe, Don, Ed Iverson, Eric Wasserman, and Glenn Wilson. Thank you all so much for your support. It is truly appreciated. So let's get going. So now that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is out and we're talking about it, let's look at the Artificer. And with the Artificer, the first thing to note is because the Artificer is a class that was added to the game after the Player's Handbook, we don't see it in the Player's Handbook, and it was actually included in Eberron Rising of the Last War, which is a setting-specific book. Now, there was some text under the Artificer suggesting that it could be added to other campaign settings, but if your DM was running a campaign in a different setting and they disallowed Eberron Rising from Last War, unless they made an exception allowing Artificer, the Artificer wasn't available to you. So I do think we'll be able to see the Artificer available in more campaigns now, and that is definitely a good thing. Now, on the other hand, I'll note that every class in the game except for Artificer got some optional class features, which are a boost to those classes, and the Artificer missed out on those, which is too bad, because the Artificer, I wouldn't say, is one of the more powerful classes, and they really could have used, if everybody else is going to get a boost, it would have been nice for them to get a boost as well, and they didn't get that, and that is unfortunate. But one thing they did do with the Artificer is, with the reprint, they have made some changes, and a lot of those changes, I think, they're not necessarily power boosts, but they definitely fix some issues with the way that the class was presented mechanically. And so we are going to have a lot of the questions we had before answered. And so that is going to make playing an Artificer a lot more clear in how it is supposed to work. So I'm far more comfortable with the Artificer as it's presented in Tasha's than I was with how it was presented in Eberron Rising from the Last War. So there has definitely been improvement. So what we're going to do in this video is, first off, I'm going to go over the mechanical changes we saw to the Artificer, explain how they work and the problems that they fixed. I'm going to talk about at least one problem they didn't fix, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the new infusions that are available to Artificer, and then I'm going to go into the Armorer subclass in detail, and then I'm going to finish the video by kind of going over how good I think it is and how I think you could make it work effectively for your character. So let's go over the changes they made to the base class. We'll go over these pretty quickly. The first thing they fixed was with spellcasting, because with spellcasting in the original printing, it said that in order for an Artificer to cast spells, they had to be holding a set of tools or some other kind of spell focus. That might have been one of their infusions. But regardless of whether the spell had a material component or the M component under the components of the spell, they had to hold their spell focus. Now the problem is, because of the way spell focuses work in combination with somatic components, it wasn't entirely clear that if a spell didn't have a material component, whether or not you could use your hand that was holding that focus in order to complete the somatic component. In fact, technically, if we were to read the rules very carefully and technically, you wouldn't be able to. You would have had to have had one hand to hold the focus and another hand to complete the somatic component, if the spell didn't have a material component already. But now what they've done is, basically, if it is an Artificer spell, it automatically has a material component, which makes sense thematically. because, of course, remember that the Artificer is technically using technology in order to kind of complete their magical spells. So I think it makes sense that their spells would always have a material component. But in addition, it makes it so that as long as you are holding a spell focus, including potentially an infusion, which might be your shield that's an infusion or your weapon that's an infusion, then you don't need that free hand to complete the somatic component. So that is a big improvement in the way that the Artificer is worded, though I do think it was probably played that way at most tables. Now at least it clarifies that's the way it's intended to be played. The second thing we see are the way the Homunculus and the Steel Defender, which are kind of pets that an Artificer might have, either a base Artificer or specifically a Battlesmith. And in Eberron Rising from the Last War, there was some very strange wording in how proficiency bonus interacted with the abilities of those creatures. That has been cleared up now, so nice changes there. So for example, if you want your Homunculus to use your spell storing item, for example, that's been opened up. And whatever else you wanted to do, been opened up as well. So all good things. Now on the downside, I'll mention that the level 7 ability Flash of Genius, which allows you to add your intelligence modifier to an ability check or saving throw of yourself or potentially somebody else using your reaction. That has always had the issue where it doesn't say when you use it, because sometimes these kinds of bonuses are added before the roll is made, sometimes they're added after the roll is made but before the results are known, and sometimes they're actually added after the results are known, potentially changing the results. And we see examples of all three of those in the game, and these abilities usually specify when they are used, but Flash of Genius still doesn't say when it's used. So it's up to your DM when it's used. Personally, if I'm your DM, I would have you add it after the roll is made, but before the results are known, but that's not necessarily going to be universal because the ability doesn't say. So it's going to be up to your DM when it's going to be used. So those are the changes to the Artificer. So now let's get into the infusions. The first new infusion we see is Arcane Propulsion Armor. This is a 14th level infusion, so you are not going to get this until very late game, if at all, depending on the campaign, and it requires attunement. So I would expect something that is not available to 14th level and is going to require attunement to be really good. I don't think Arcane Propulsion Armor is all that great. It increases your walking speed by 5 feet. I'll take a movement boost, but 5 feet isn't that much. We're going to get gauntlets that we can use as weapons. They're not great weapons. They do d8 damage, which is fine. Now it's force, which is reliable, but honestly, magical damage, whether it's piercing, bludgeoning, or slashing, tends to be pretty reliable anyways. And they get the throw-in property, and they essentially work like returning weapons. Throw-in isn't that strong an option for characters in Dungeons & Dragons. If you were going to make a throwing build, you probably needed to have it worked out before 14th level. Now the armor can't be removed against your will. I don't see that coming up at all. And if you are missing any limbs, this works basically like a prosthetic. You can wear it and it's going to replace those limbs. That could be useful in some situations, though generally speaking, there's not a lot of mechanics for losing limbs in Dungeons & Dragons. There's some optional rules in Dungeon Master's Guide for doing so, but I think in most campaigns it doesn't come up. So I don't see Arcane Propulsion Armor being used in a lot of campaigns. I don't see selecting it at 14th level myself unless I was in one of those unique situations where maybe somebody did lose a limb and we don't have the regeneration spell. This would be an option for that. But I think, for the most part, I think it's pretty weak considering it's 14th level and requiring attunement. Second thing we see is the Armor of Magical Strength. This one, fortunately, does not have a level requirement, so we can take it right at second level when we first get infusions. I think this one is pretty good. Number one, if you are going to make a strength check or strength saving throw, you can use a charge and add the intelligence bonus to the roll. Now, it is the intelligence bonus of the person who's wearing it, not of the Artificer. So if you are actually making this for somebody else, if they don't have a good intelligence bonus, they're not going to get much from this. But if we're going to use it on ourselves, we're going to expect we'll probably have a good intelligence, so we could really make use of this. The second is if you're knocked prone, you could use a charge and not be knocked prone. Now that is pretty circumstantial, but sometimes being knocked prone is really bad, so I could see it being occasionally useful. But where I see this being most useful is if I was going to make something like, say, a grapple build, and I was to take even 2 levels of Artificer, I could see grabbing Armor of Magical Strength because it would allow me to add that intelligence bonus to those grapple checks, and if I had, say, advantage through some other source, it would stack, so it could make your grapple checks even more reliable. Next one we have is Helm of Awareness. This is a 10th level infusion, so it is pretty high level, and it does require attunement, but this is basically like a weapon of warning. It's going to give you advantage on initiative rolls, and you can't be surprised unless you're incapacitated, and these things are both really good, and like a weapon of warning is good, this is something I would want to have. Now the Homunculus Servant existed before, but as I mentioned before, we have got new options with the Homunculus because the actions it can take are no longer limited, and that's a big boost to this. So I like the Homunculus Servant a lot more now. Also, if you have nothing to do with your bonus action, it's worth taking a Homunculus Servant. It doesn't do much damage, but you can use your bonus action to deliver a little bit more damage. So if you're not going to use your bonus action, it's better than not using it. The next new infusion is the Mind Sharpener. This is an infusion you're going to put on a set of armor or robes, and basically it's got 4 charges. If the wearer fails a constitution save for concentration, they can just use one of the charges and then they succeed instead. Nice thing here is this is something that you're going to use after you fail, so you're only using the charges when they're going to be useful to you. And this is just really good. Now, this is not something I'd use on myself as an artificer because as a half caster, you're likely not nearly the best caster in your party. You're going to give this to, the cleric or the druid or the bard or the sorcerer or the warlock or the wizard. They all can make better use of it than you can, and it's a really good item for them. But if they have this item and this item does not use attunement, so they're not even giving up an attunement slot, basically, 4 checks they would have failed, they can turn into successes. And generally, with a spellcaster, I'm not expecting to fail more than 4 concentration saves in a day. If I do, I'm in big trouble. Then I'm not a very good spellcaster. But this is going to take up to 4 fails and turn them into successes, and that really makes a big difference, especially in those mid-levels where you're just concentrating on really powerful spells and game-changing spells. And often the tactic of the enemy is to try to break the concentration of the caster, and you're going to make that pretty impossible for them. And that is really big as a boost to your party. So I think this is a really good infusion to take. This brings us to the last item, which is the Spell-Refueling Ring. This requires attunement. It's available at 6th level, and this is basically a Pearl of Power. So you can recover a spell slot of up to 3rd level, and you can do it basically once per day. And I would, at 6th level, consider taking this, and I would hand it again off to a full caster because they are going to make better use of this than you can at that level because they are going to have access to 3rd level spells and you won't. But once you do get access to 3rd level slots, it might be better for you because those 3rd level slots will be more valuable to you than to those other party members, and you can have less spell slots altogether, so recovering a 3rd level slot is kind of a big deal. Now, I don't think this is a super powerful item, but Pearl Power is a decent item, and so using this for infusion I think is a decent choice and something I would at least consider. But I think if I got high level and I'm into 4th or 5th level slots as an artificer, I think we still can come up with better things to do than this. But between 6th level and the point where I'm still using 3rd level slots as my highest level slot, I think in those levels, in that window, this is a still pretty decent item. So let's talk about the new subclass in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the Armorer. So the theme of this subclass is it is an artificer who specializes in enhancing armor. And they're going to enhance their own armor, and there's a number of different ways they can do so. Now we get a fair number of abilities at 3rd level. The first one of those is Tools of the Trade. What you're going to get is proficiency with heavy armor and proficiency with Smith's Tools. And if you already have Smith's Tools proficiency, you can take a different kind of tool. Now the thing I'll note here is this makes the Armorer the only kind of artificer that gets proficiency with heavy armor. Then of course we're going to get our subclass spells. So the Armorer spells are, at 3rd level you're going to get Magic Missile and Thunder Wave. Apparently in the Unearthed Arcana, Shield was one of these spells, and Shield would be really nice on this subclass, and it is unfortunate they don't get it. Now, I will mention that Artificer and Wizard multiclass very easily. I could easily see taking a 2-dip level in Wizard and grabbing something like War Magic, and that could get you your Shield spell and a couple other reaction options. but I would prefer if it was right on the list. That said, Magic Missile, Thunderwave are both decent spells at low levels. But it is a little strange that a subclass that is focused on armor seems to have generally offensive spells, and we have 2 offensive spells at level 3. At 5th level, we're going to get Mirror Image and Shatter. Mirror Image, I think, is a nice spell for this subclass, actually, especially if you're going into the melee option, and I'll go over that in a little bit. And Shatter is a decent low-level area of effect damage spell. Now, by the time you get Shatter, full casters are going to be able to cast spells like Fireball. Fireball's a lot better than Shatter. But for a half caster at 5th level, I could see using Shatter. The 9th level spells we get, Hypnotic Pattern and Lightning Bolt. Hypnotic Pattern is a great addition to this spell list because not only is it a great spell, but it's one of those spells that continues to be great at higher levels. So despite the fact that you're getting it as a half caster, it's still going to be really, really good, even though you're getting it 4 levels later than full casters. Lightning Bolt is the opposite situation. It's one of those spells that reduces in effect as you go up in levels, and so by 9th level, 8d6 isn't all that impressive anymore, and the problem with Lightning Bolt, especially compared to Fireball, is you can expect to get a lot less creatures in the area of effect in a Lightning Bolt than a Fireball, and this is kind of the point of these big area of effect spells, is to get lots of creatures in them. Lightning Bolt really doesn't deliver on that. Not that Lightning Bolt is a terrible spell, but I don't think it's something that I'm likely to use my 3rd level slots for. At 13th level, we get Fire Shield and Greater Invisibility. I actually like both these spells for this subclass. Fire Shield on this subclass is really nice, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I do think that Fire Shield is a really good spell to be on the Armorer list. Greater Invisibility is, generally speaking, a pretty decent spell, and I could see casting it once in a while. I think it's the weaker of the 2 on my 13th level list. I'm more likely to be casting Fire Shield. And then at 17th level, we're getting Pass Wall, Wall of Force. Wall of Force, of course, is one of the best spells for its level in the game. Thing is as a half caster, when you are 17th level, your spells just aren't really impressive compared to any of the full caster's spells. So Wall of Force is a good addition on here, but I don't think you're going to find it particularly dramatic anymore at 17th level. So the Armorer spells, I totally understand why people are disappointed to see Shield gone from here, but overall this is a pretty solid list. So the final feature we get at 3rd level is Arcane Armor, and this is really 2 features, because we are getting the ability to create 2 very distinct sets of armor. But no matter which kind of armor you're creating, there are certain universal benefits you're going to see. So when you have a suit of armor you are wearing, you can use an action to turn it into Arcane Armor. And I'm going to note that unlike a lot of other abilities of subclasses for Artificer, you are not limited on this. So you can do this if you're going to switch your armor, you can do it again. It's not going to use spell slots or in any way limited. So technically speaking, we could switch armors out over and over again, and we can always enhance them with our Arcane Armor feature. All it's going to take is one action. So the universal enhancements you're going to get is if the armor normally has a strength requirement, Arcane Armor lacks the requirement for you. So this only applies to heavy armor, so if you are wearing heavy armor, you don't have to worry about your strength. So this is going to allow us to wear the heavy armor, and we can still really focus on our intelligence. Second thing, we can use the Arcane Armor as a spellcasting focus for our Artificer spells. Third thing, the armor attaches to you, can't be removed against your will. I don't think armor being removed against your will is that big a thing in D&D. I don't remember that ever happening to me. I mean, occasionally, I guess, if you're captured, but if you're captured, you kind of have to comply with their wishes regardless. So I'm not sure I see that coming up. It also expands to cover your entire body, although you can retract or deploy the helmet as a bonus action. I assume this is because they obviously were inspired by Iron Man, so they want like the helmet that can retract and then recover automatically. The armor replaces any missing limbs, functioning identically to the limb it replaces. So as you can see, we are seeing that redundancy I mentioned with the Arcane Propulsion armor, which is why you probably don't want to use that infusion on yourself. And you can doff or don the armor as an action. This one I can actually see coming up. I have absolutely played in D&D in multiple editions, including 5th, where you are stuck in heavy armor and you wish you could get it off, or you are stuck with no armor and you wish you could don your armor much faster. And then the armor continues to be arcane armor until you don another suit of armor or you die. Now there's an application of that you might not consider, so just to remind you, if ever you do actually die in combat and then you're brought back with something like a Revivify and you're going right back into the action, remember that you're going to have to use an action to re-enchant your armor. Now, as I mentioned, when you change your suit of armor into arcane armor, you're going to make one of two selections. You're going to choose either the Guardian or the Infiltrator armor. In either case, you're going to get a special weapon with that armor, and that weapon alone, you can add your intelligence modifier instead of strength or dexterity for the attack and damage rolls. Now I'll mention that's not as good as the ability that the Battlesmith gets, because the Battlesmith has a lot more versatility. Battlesmith can use a hand crossbow and get their intelligence bonus. They can use a heavy weapon and get their intelligence bonus. And that's going to allow them to use their intelligence bonus in conjunction with a lot of feats that make different combat options effective. The Armorer is not going to have that, because these weapons, as we're going to look, are okay, but they're not great. So our first option is the Guardian option, and this would essentially be our melee option. Now the weapon we get with this are Thunder Gauntlets, and basically the gauntlets count as simple weapons. Note they do not count as light weapons, so you can't do two-weapon fighting with them or anything like that. They are a 1d8 melee weapon, so the same damage you would expect from doing, say, a long sword one-handed. They do thunder damage instead of bludgeoning damage as you might expect, so thunder damage is pretty reliable, though it is no more reliable than bludgeoning damage if it is magical. The nice thing about these weapons is a creature hit by the gauntlet has disadvantage on attack rolls against targets other than you until the start of your next turn, and so you get a tanking option. So here again we see the point where we would kind of like to see the shield spell here. Because although you could have heavy armor and a shield, and you could probably have a fairly decent armor class with this character, you don't have that boost that a shield spell would get you. And when you put yourself in that tanking position, that is something you probably want to be thinking about, because as soon as you become a target of all the enemies, when you don't have a defensive option such as the shield spell, you don't have all that many hit points either. You could just be in a position where you're going to end up downed yourself. Though when we do get to the level where we can cast Fire Shield, I can see that actually being really good here, because it's not using our concentration, and if we're incentivizing creatures to attack us, then that's more creatures that are going to be taking that 2d8 damage. Now it does give you the ability to boost your durability to a certain extent, because you also get the defensive field. This requires a bonus action to use, and you get temporary hit points equal to your level in the class. And of course temporary hit points don't stack, so if you already have temporary hit points, this just replaces those. And you can do this a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, and you get it back after a long rest. Now I have to say, this isn't enough. This is a pretty weak defensive option. Your level in temporary hit points is less than you can get from a lot of different methods in Dungeons & Dragons. This is a fairly low amount of temporary hit points. And we can't use it very often. Your proficiency bonus every long rest means at 3rd level you can do this twice in an entire day, and at 5th level it'll go to 3 times per day. That is not a heck of a lot of temporary hit points. I'll also note that in Tasha's we see lots of different ways that temporary hit points can be awarded, often to the entire group. So this might also be redundant. So I don't think this ends up being a particularly strong ability, the defensive field part. The Thunder Gauntlets, first thing I'll note is you are not going to do a lot of damage with these. This is not going to be a striker character. D8 plus your intelligence bonus damage is not a lot of damage, and our options for making these powerful through feats are really limited. So it really just becomes about tanking, getting the disadvantage to attack anybody but you. But if you're going to go that route, I think you really need to think about how you're going to protect yourself, because again, you do not have the shield spell. Now, having spells like Mirror Image helps. Having spells like Fire Shield can help at least punish those who are attacking you. But if I wanted to go the route where I'm really going to focus on using the Guardian aspect of the armor, then I really would consider some multi-classing here. But one way or the other, on its own, I'm not sure it's going to work out of the box all that well. I think you are going to need to multi-class to make this effective. And again, you're not going to be a damage dealer. This is generally something you would do as a method of defending other party members. The other option you have is the Infiltrator armor. So if you do the Infiltrator option instead of the Guardian option, you're going to get the Lightning Launcher as your weapon. This is a ranged weapon, has a 90-foot short range, 300 feet long range. The damage it deals is 1d6 lightning damage on a hit. Now I'll note that lightning damage is probably actually less reliable than magical piercing damage. And the special ability of this weapon is once on each of your turns when you hit a creature with it, you can do an extra d6 lightning damage. So take a d6, roll it, add it to the damage. That alone is not going to make this a good damage weapon. The lightning launcher just doesn't have the options you have, say, with a hand crossbow and using it with things like Crossbow Expert. Though I think you can at least get decent damage with this through the sharpshooter feat. Ideally, you'd be looking for ways to get advantage in addition to this. So I could see doing something like maybe 2 levels of rogue, grabbing the sharpshooter feat, and then going through with the lightning launcher, and that could work okay. But I just don't think you're going to be doing the damage that if you were just using a weapon you could do. But I think you can get it to the point where at least it's relevant damage. You actually get 2 additional abilities with the Infiltrator armor. The first is your walking speed is going to increase by 5 feet. The second is you're going to get advantage on dexterity stealth checks. Note that if your armor normally imposes disadvantage on stealth, then that's just going to cancel out. So if you really want to make a stealthy character, you're probably going to want to put this on some armor that isn't going to impose that disadvantage. Now when I first read these abilities, the first thing I thought is, well, maybe you could just have 2 sets of armor, right? You have a set of full plate and then maybe you have a set of studded leather or something like that. And you could just switch because of course you can don and doff the armor very quickly. And then you could use one for Guardian armor and the other for Infiltrator armor. And I probably would do that, except I will point out that I think you need to kind of specialize in your character build on one or the other if you want to be effective. If you're just doing straight armor and you're just kind of counting on these abilities on their own to make your character effective, I think you're going to be disappointed. Because whether you're in the Guardian armor or the Infiltrator armor, unless you specialized in it to some degree or thought about your build, you're not going to do good damage, and I don't think you're going to have a big impact on the battle. At 5th level, we get extra attack. This is vital to this subclass, so I'm glad to see this here. Now at 9th level, I think we get what I would consider the premier ability of the Armorer. And if I was going to play an Armorer, the 9th level feature is what I'd be looking forward to. Your armor counts as separate items for the purpose of infusing, so your chest piece, boots, helmet, they're all considered separate, so you can put multiple infusions on your armor, and our maximum number of infusions is going to increase by 2. Now those 2 extra infusions both have to be in our Arcane Armor, but I'm probably going to want a couple infusions in my Arcane Armor, so that's not a problem. So if you are playing an Artificer, the Arcane Infusions are pretty much the best ability you get as the base class, and getting 2 additional infusions is a big deal. I mean, at level 9, you could expect to have 3 infusions normally, so we're talking about going right from 3 infusions to 5 infusions. Now, there is a downside here that I'm thinking about that won't affect everybody, but let's say you are in a campaign where you just happen to find some really good magical full plate armor. Well, you can't do infusions on magical items, so just be aware of that. And your DM might say that, you know, hey, if you're going to infuse different pieces of your armor as different items, then maybe only the chest piece is considered to be magical. I don't know. That's totally in the realm of the DM. And so this is a really nice feature. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, the most attractive one that the Armorer gets. And then at 15th level, we get our final ability. It's called Perfected Armor, and it's going to improve the Guardian and Infiltrator features for our armor. The Guardian feature, honestly, I consider pretty disappointing. The idea is if a creature that's huge or smaller ends its turn within 30 feet of you, you can use your reaction to try to pull it towards you. And then if it ends within 5 feet of you, you can make a melee attack as part of that reaction. That in itself would be a pretty good ability, but there's 2 reasons why I don't think this is very good. The first is it is going to provide a saving throw, so we're using our reaction and nothing might happen. The second is that we can only do this a number of times equal to our proficiency bonus. And even at high levels, that we're going to go through that pretty quick. So we have an ability that's really limited in use. And even when you use it, it's going to use your reaction, might not work. So if it works, I think it's still pretty good. But the unreliability, along with the limited use, especially considering the level we are, this is a high level ability. I just don't think it stacks up. The Infiltrator ability, I think, is better. When you hit somebody with your special weapon, it's going to emit magical light. It's going to have disadvantage on attack rolls against you. That's good. In addition, the next roll you are going to have against it has advantage. And if you're specializing in Infiltrator armor, you probably have Sharpshooter, so that's good. And it's going to inflict an additional d6 lightning damage. And that's okay. I mean, it's not a big boost for that level, but I'll take another d6. So the 15th level ability for Infiltrator, I think, is a fairly decent ability. And so when we put all this together, what I see is a missed opportunity here to make an armor somebody who could switch between melee and ranged reasonably effectively, because I don't think we quite get there. I think we can make a moderately effective melee character with this if we are focused on tanking rather than doing damage. This is not the subclass you want to play if you want to be a melee damage dealer. And I think with the Infiltrator armor, with a little bit of specialization, we can make a half-decent range character. Not the best range character. A battlesmith can make a better range character than an armorer can in terms of doing damage. But we do get those advantage on the stealth checks and the other bonuses that the Arcane Armor gives us. Really, if I'm going range, the main reason I would consider going armorer instead of battlesmith is for the 9th level ability that gives you the 2 extra infusions. That's a really good ability, and that is something that might make that worthwhile. But in either case, if I want to do melee or range, I think if you want to be effective, you have to kind of specialize your build for one or the other, so we don't get the versatility that this initially reads like it provides. I think you're either going to be a moderately decent range build that's pretty lousy in melee, or a moderately effective melee build that's pretty lousy at ranged. And that's too bad. I wish they had designed it in a way that you could be effective in either and kind of switch back and forth. I think that would have been really cool. So how good do I think the armor is overall? Well, I think because of the 9th level ability giving the 2 extra infusions, I think this isn't a bad subclass, but I would still call it one of the weaker ones for Artificer. I think we're looking at the Battlesmith still being the best subclass for the Artificer, with the Artillerist following up. Especially at lower levels, the Artillerist works really well. I don't think the Artillerist works as well at high levels. And then the Armor comes in third. Now I'll say that the Armor is probably closer in rank to the Battlesmith and the Artillerist than it is to the Alchemist. I think with a few smart choices you can make a reasonably effective Armorer, and I can go into combat with an Armorer and I know what I'm supposed to do. And those are things the Alchemist doesn't have. So overall, I don't think this is a terrible subclass, but I'm less excited about this subclass than a lot of other ones I see in Tasha's. But I do like the fact that there is another Artificer that I might consider if I'm going to make an Artificer. But I am kind of excited to look at some builds for armor, because I do have some ideas. I think if I was doing a straight classed armor, something like the Goblin, and working that in with Sharpshooter and the Infiltrator armor, I think could work reasonably well. I haven't done the build yet, I haven't done the math yet, but that's what I'm kind of my instincts are telling me right now anyway, is that if I did that, that could work out reasonably well. And I am thinking about some multi-class options that I think could work reasonably well as well, whether I was focusing on Guardian or on Infiltrator. So I'm kind of interested to play with some builds here, because I think there are good things in the armor, even though I don't think it's necessarily the strongest subclass overall. So I will probably be presenting some armor builds at some point, so stay tuned to the channel for that. Otherwise, next week I'm thinking I'm going to start looking at the Druid subclasses, so stay tuned for that. And until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.